My family banned me from the reunion for being a failure, then they saw my name on the building. The message came at 2 p.m. on a Thursday. I was reviewing sent profile updates for a new meditation suite when my phone buzzed. The sender was my Aunt Audrey, and the message read simply, "Dixie dear, this year's reunion will be held at the Bloom LA flagship. We'd like to keep things elegant and high-achieving. Please understand it's best if you don't attend." I stared at the screen, not quite blinking, while the scent of eucalyptus and white tea rose quietly from the diffuser beside me. Audrey had always spoken in riddles, but this one was crystal clear. I wasn't welcome. Not because there wasn't space, not because of logistics, but because, once again, I was the blemish on their curated portrait of generational success. My name is Dixie D'Amelio. I'm 32 years old, based in Los Angeles, and I'm the founder of Bloom Retreats, a wellness hospitality group with 9 properties across 5 states. You may have heard of us if you're into silence therapy, restorative travel, or deep sensory retreats. If you haven't, that's all right. We don't advertise on billboards, we don't chase headlines. And most importantly, we don't throw our resumes at cocktail parties. Unlike my family. Growing up as a D'Amelio in Austin, Texas, meant waking up early, dressing like you might run into a donor at breakfast, and reciting accomplishments like they were gospel. My mother, Eleanor, ran one of the top PR firms in the region and still found time to run 3 charity boards. My father, Daniel, chaired Legacy Holdings, a financial firm that essentially dictated local development policy behind closed doors. My sister, Clara, developed a gene therapy platform in college and was on the cover of Forbes by 28. My brother Theo quoted the Constitution before he turned 10 and now runs a legal practice advising political candidates. And then there was me, the soft one, the observer, the girl who asked how people felt instead of what they planned to do next quarter. From a young age, I was fascinated by spaces, how they made people breathe differently, soften their voice, remember something they didn't know they needed. I could walk into a room and sense what needed to change: the angle of the light, the fabric on the chairs, the smell of the air. It started with our family's lake house. I would rearrange cushions and place flowers in antique bottles, add soundscapes to the hallways, and shift the way people entered and left rooms. When guests left smiling, I wasn't proud of the compliments. I was proud that I had made them feel seen. My parents dismissed it as mood dressing. Aunt Audrey once called it wellness fluff and told me to go shadow my sister if I wanted to understand real impact. When I told them at 18 that I wanted to pursue hospitality strategy, no one even pretended to be surprised. Dad said flatly, "So you'll be folding towels," Mom cried behind closed doors. Theo sent me a link to law school admissions as a joke. Clara just said, "Oh." They offered one condition: if I got into Wharton, they'd support my education as long as I switched to finance or real estate planning. I applied, got in, and turned it down. I ended up at a small design-forward business school in California, working nights at a roadside inn to pay rent. The day I moved out, no one hugged me. My mother handed me a stack of pre-written recommendation letters in case I changed my mind, and Dad said, "You have 6 months to realize how the world works." I carried that sentence like a brick. In school, I studied sensory psychology, spatial design, cultural empathy, in-service models, anything that touched the human side of experience. I worked weekends at a silent meditation resort, mopping floors and observing patterns of silence and discomfort. I didn't post any of it. I didn't call home. By the time I was 24, I had mapped out my first retreat model on scraps of recycled notebooks. I still have them tear-stained and warped by incense and spilled coffee. The year Clara got engaged to the CEO of a biotech unicorn, I launched Bloom in a forgotten lakeside chapel that I converted with borrowed funds and a mentor's silent backing. The night it opened, I slept in the linen closet because we couldn't afford staff overnight. I remember thinking, this isn't what winning looks like in my family's eyes, but it's the first time I felt like I had roots. 12 years later, when my aunt's message came, I didn't feel rage. I felt a strange clarity. They'd chosen Bloom for their reunion. The very place I'd built touch by touch, word by word, breath by breath. And they didn't know. They didn't want to know. What they also didn't know was that every wine pairing, every scent in every hallway, every custom music set list, they'd all go through me, because I was the one who signed off on every VIP event, including theirs. Now the question wasn't if I'd show up, it was how. The first year on my own was nothing like I imagined. I found a tiny studio apartment above a hardware store in Santa Rosa, 3 blocks from the motel where I worked night shifts. The room smelled like varnish and cigarette ash, and when it rained, water leaked through the window frame and soaked the corner where I kept my mattress. I didn't complain. I didn't tell anyone. I worked the front desk from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, then caught a few hours of sleep before heading to class. I lived on toast and instant miso, and by mid-semester I had memorized the sound of every guest's footsteps by the weight of their stride. When one woman started crying in the lobby after being denied a refund for a broken heater, I brought her a cup of hot tea without saying a word. She looked at me like I had given her a life raft. I remember thinking, this is what I want to do. Not fix people, not dazzle them, but remind them that they matter in the quietest moments. I knew I was good at it, but good doesn't mean visible, and visible is all my family ever valued. While Clara was flying to Zurich for biotech panels, and Theo was being profiled in political blogs, I was folding towels with precision and annotating scent impact studies by flashlight. Every now and then I'd get an email from home, always stiff and short. No one asked what I was building. No one asked why I stayed. It wasn't until the summer after my second year that something shifted. A man checked into the motel under the name Jordan Quinn. Middle-aged, well-dressed, carrying only one bag and a laptop. He had the look of someone used to being listened to, but he didn't treat anyone like they were beneath him. I checked him in, handed him a folded welcome note, and offered him a corner room we rarely used, simply because I'd noticed he seemed uncomfortable with foot traffic. He smiled, said thank you, and didn't say anything else. 2 nights later, I was cleaning up a spill from a cracked coffee pot when he came down to the front desk and asked me if I had ever considered working for something larger. I laughed. I was wearing a bleach-stained polo and hadn't slept in 36 hours. He wasn't joking. He told me he'd been watching not in a creepy way, but in the way people watch when they know the industry inside and out. He was a strategic advisor for an independent luxury resort group and offered me a weekend assistant role for their upcoming design conference. It paid almost nothing, but I said yes without thinking. That weekend changed everything. I watched how they handled scent layering, temperature modulation, ambient sound therapy. I took notes. I asked questions. I helped reorganize their post-event follow-up system, and by Sunday night they offered me a part-time remote role in guest experience research. For the first time, someone who mattered in the industry saw something in me without needing a polished LinkedIn or a last name. Jordan never asked about my family. I think he could tell that part of the story came with damage. Over the next year, I juggled school, my motel job, and the remote gig. My GPA dipped, but my ideas didn't. I pitched my first micro-retreat model during an internal innovation challenge, and while it didn't win, it caught the attention of someone else. A woman named Sienna Blake. She was an investor with a background in trauma recovery and hospitality mergers. She emailed me 3 days after the presentation with one sentence. Let's talk about healing through space. Sienna didn't want reports. She wanted vision. She asked what I would do if I had $500,000 and the trust to build something different. I told her I would buy a forgotten chapel near Lake Travis, strip it down to bone and silence, and build a retreat, not for influencers or spa seekers, but for people who had learned to hide their pain behind success. She nodded and wired the money a week later. I flew back to Austin without telling anyone. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew what they'd say, that it was reckless niche, not scalable. I didn't care. I lived inside the construction site for 6 months. I scraped mold off beams with my own hands. I picked every tile, tested every candle blend, and created every staff script from scratch. On opening night, I wore the same blazer I'd bought at a secondhand store in college and served guests myself. The reviews were quiet at first, then reverent. People whispered about the way Bloom made them feel. Like they could exhale. It wasn't flashy. But it was mine. And I had built it without apology, without begging for anyone's approval. So when Audrey's message came years later banning me from a reunion at the very place I had created, I didn't feel small. I felt surgical. Because the real reunion wasn't between my family and each other. It was between them and the person they'd refused to see for more than a decade. By the time Bloom had expanded to 5 locations across 3 states, I had stopped keeping track of what my siblings were doing. Not because I didn't care, but because it no longer felt like a race I needed to finish. Clara had launched a second startup in gene therapy, Theo was on a mayoral campaign trail, and my parents were hosting private dinners with senators and board members. I saw the photos sometimes when I couldn't sleep scrolling quietly through tagged posts from guests who happened to know my family. There was always the same polished energy in those images, like everything was positioned, just right, lit just so. I had once thought it was elegance, now it just looked like fear of imperfection. Bloom was different. Our guests weren't looking for perfection. They came because something had broken. A marriage, a career, a belief system. They came not to forget pain, but to learn how to sit beside it without shame. Our staff didn't rehearse smiles. We trained in presence. We studied how to listen without performing empathy. Our reputation grew slowly, but with substance. One article in The Atlantic called us a quiet revolution in healing hospitality. A trauma therapist booked her entire caseload across 4 months. A retired judge flew in alone and left hugging a bellhop. Still, I said no to press. I didn't want the story to be about me. I wanted the story to be about what was possible when you built a space from intention instead of status. The flagship Bloom LA opened the year I turned 30. It was the largest project we'd ever attempted, a reimagined 1,932nd hilltop estate overlooking Griffith Park. We preserved the bones of the building but stripped away its ego. The pool was repurposed into a silent garden with floating lanterns. The wine cellar became a scent library. I lived on site for 10 months, overseeing everything from tile grout to guest flow psychology. Sienna called it madness. Jordan called it commitment. I called it home. That spring, I received the reunion email. It came through the Bloom General Inquiry inbox addressed to events director. I opened it out of habit, thinking it was a standard corporate booking. The subject line read, D'Amelio Family Legacy Reunion Inquiry. I stared at it for almost a minute. Audrey had copied my mother, my father, Clara, Theo, and about 20 cousins. There was no mention of me. No one even noticed the address they had emailed belonged to my company. They requested a full buyout of Bloom LA for 3 days in July, private access to the gardens, an invitation-only gala, a wellness brunch with guided breathwork. I almost laughed. Breathwork. From the same people who told me my career was aromatherapy nonsense, I scrolled through their requests. Organic catering, custom amenity baskets, and signature scent customization for each room. All the things I had spent years developing, all the things I had been mocked for. They didn't just want my space, they wanted my philosophy. And they still hadn't asked who built it. For a brief second I wondered if it was intentional. Maybe they knew. Maybe this was their way of extending an olive branch without saying it aloud. Then I got the text. It came from Audrey again. Not the public group email, but my personal number. I hadn't heard from her in 9 years. Dixie darling, I see your name somehow attached to Bloom, impressive if a bit unexpected. But just to be clear, the family would prefer not to cause confusion at the reunion. Best to keep roles clear. Guest lists are tight. Let's reconnect another time. There it was. A decade of labor reduced to somehow attached. Not only was I not invited, I was being warned not to exist too visibly in my own space. I didn't respond. I didn't forward the message. I just stared out the window of my office and let it land, not with anger but with finality. Rachel, my assistant, walked in a few minutes later to review the event calendar. She paused when she saw my expression. I showed her the message. She scrolled, frowned, then looked at me like I had just told her my family had burned down the building. They don't know, she asked quietly. They don't care, I said, just as quiet. We sat in silence for a long time. Then she spoke again, this time slowly. You know you could cancel the booking. Or price them out. Or just show up and let them choke on it. I shook my head. That's not who we are. They don't get to drag our standards down. She nodded, but her eyes stayed sharp. Then what are you going to do? I turned back to the screen. The guest list was already attached. 57 names. All the cousins who once called me housekeeping. All the aunts who whispered about my sad little career. My parents. My siblings. Every one of them walking into my space with no idea what it cost to build. What I decided in that moment wasn't revenge. It was presence. They were finally stepping into my world. And they were going to feel everything I'd spent 12 years creating. Without knowing, I was the one who built it. I approved the event contract the next morning. I didn't change a single clause, no special conditions, no backdoor cancellations, no reveal baked into the paperwork. I simply signed the digital file, flagged it for the finance team, and sent the final itinerary to our guest experience coordinator. On the outside, it was just another high-end booking at Bloom LA. But inside, something had shifted. This was the first time I had ever allowed my personal and professional worlds to collide, even if it was still behind a curtain. I wasn't doing it to prove anything. I wasn't looking for acknowledgement. But I wanted them to feel what I had spent over a decade refining. The quiet dignity of intentional care. The way space could disarm the most guarded heart without saying a word. Over the next 4 weeks, I worked alongside Madison, our on-site general manager, to prepare. We reviewed every detail from the floral palette to the energy flow between rooms. Audrey had requested a classic layout for the dinner gala, so I suggested we flip the seating orientation to maximize the view of the gardens. My mother had asked for custom herbal blends for the guest baskets, so we curated scent profiles based on subtle family archetypes: lavender for control, mint for legacy, bergamot for anxiety. We didn't do it with sarcasm. We did it with precision. If they wanted exclusivity, they would get something beyond what their name had ever bought them before. Madison asked early on whether the staff should be briefed about the guest's relationship to me. I shook my head. Let them be who they always are. We don't need a performance. She nodded without asking further. That's what I valued most about the people I worked with. They didn't need the drama to deliver excellence. They just needed clarity and purpose. I gave them both. I did not speak to my family at all during this time. No one reached out to confirm logistics or send a private thank you. Audrey sent a 3-line update to the event's inbox asking for early check-in access and a revised wine list. Clara posted about her new clinical trial. Theo tweeted something vague about policy reform. It was all business as usual. If any of them suspected I was involved, they didn't show it. Or maybe they just didn't think I could be. The week of the event, I moved into a side suite at the property to observe preparations. From my window, I could see the entrance path lined with lemon myrtle and white hydrangea swaying softly in the June air. It felt surreal watching the team move like clockwork, preparing for guests who still thought I was invisible. They had spent years designing their lives to be seen. I had spent years designing spaces where people could finally rest from being seen. And now, for the first time, we were about to occupy the same space again. Friday morning came quiet and bright. I wore soft linen and sneakers, hair tied back, no makeup. I stood with the security team as the first black SUV pulled through the curved stone gate. Theo stepped out first, talking on his phone and barely glancing at the entrance. His wife followed, adjusting the collar of her silk jumpsuit. Then my parents. My mother in dove gray pearls intact. My father in a blazer that looked like it had never wrinkled in its life. They looked exactly the same, yet suddenly foreign, like something from an archived memory. I watched as Madison greeted them. She was elegant, warm, and composed. My mother complimented the scent of the welcome towels. My father asked about the wine program. Clara arrived shortly after, alone with a leather briefcase and a distracted smile. Audrey came in last, flanked by 2 assistants speaking in a clipped tone about the dinner playlist. None of them looked around long enough to notice the plaques on the walls. None of them asked who the owner was. I stayed behind the one-way glass, noting how quickly they fell into their habits. My brother's voice rose whenever he wanted to dominate the room. My mother stepped 2 inches back from staff, as if proximity might dilute her authority. Audrey insisted the floral arrangements be turned precisely 30 degrees for better photos. There was a moment just before lunch when Clara passed by the scent library. She paused briefly, inhaled the subtle rosemary and vetiver mix, and closed her eyes. Then she moved on without a word. I wondered for a second if some part of her felt something deeper, but she didn't turn around. That night, the family hosted a welcome dinner on the west lawn. The sunset burned orange behind the hills, the air soft and still. Our servers moved effortlessly through the space. Every dish was plated with care. Every wine pairing was silent poetry. I watched from a distance hidden by ivy and reflection glass. They laughed. They toasted. They discussed politics and deals, and Clara's upcoming article in a medical journal. No one mentioned me. No one even asked if I might appear. And still, I wasn't angry. I felt something quieter, heavier, not for their rejection, but for the possibility that they never once looked around and wondered who made this place feel like safety. They were being held in the very world I had built with my bare hands, and they still couldn't see the architecture behind their comfort. The gala began just after 8. The garden was transformed into something almost unreal, lit by floating spheres and strands of amber light that swayed gently with the evening breeze. Tables were arranged in soft semicircles, each with its own floral identity. The scent profile for the evening was subtle, but grounding a base of cedar and cardamom with a touch of blood orange to sharpen the air. I had chosen it myself. It reminded me of strength wrapped in restraint. I didn't walk in through the front. I entered quietly through the west corridor, a back passage originally designed for staff circulation, now lit with gallery pieces from local women artists. I wore a navy silk dress, understated but structured. No name tag, no introduction. To anyone else, I was just another guest. But to me, it was the first time I had ever walked into a family event with nothing to hide and nothing left to prove. From behind a sculptural divider, I could see my family gathered in small clusters. My mother held a glass of Pinot, nodding politely as Clara gestured through a story. My father leaned back in his chair, surveying the space with a familiar air of control. Audrey was near the central table, speaking to someone I didn't recognize, pointing at the floral arrangements as if she had chosen them herself. No one looked toward the entrance. No one asked if I was coming. I took a slow walk around the perimeter, listening, not to insert myself, just to observe what had never changed. One cousin was complaining about the wine temperature, insisting that a better venue would have pre-chilled the glasses properly. Another asked if the lavender dessert was gluten-free and made a joke about California wellness snobs. Clara laughed a little too loudly and said, "Whoever designed this place definitely read one too many spiritual manifestos." They were speaking about my work, about my team, about everything I had built with the weight of silence on my back. And still, none of them looked up long enough to ask who had curated every thread, every note, every taste. They were being held in a space I had designed to heal people from this very kind of blindness, and still they didn't see. I stopped behind one of the support pillars and listened as Audrey raised a toast. To legacy, she said, her voice clear and confident. To vision and excellence, and never lowering our standards. To family who lead, not follow, who create the future, not decorate it. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it cut clean. I felt it in my stomach, the old familiar ache. The room I had shaped for belonging was being used to reinforce exclusion. I had expected dismissal. I hadn't expected mockery delivered while sipping cocktails in my sanctuary. One of the cousins, I think his name was Evan, leaned in to Audrey and said, "Whatever happened to Dixie? Isn't she in town?" Audrey waved her hand like swatting a fly. "She's somewhere doing spa things, I imagine. Energy crystals. Poor girl never found her footing." My mother gave a polite laugh and said nothing. Clara smiled without moving her mouth. Theo, seated next to a local council member, added with a smirk, "Well, she did always have an eye for candles. Maybe she's running a boutique somewhere." That was the moment something inside me quieted completely. Not from pain, not from shock, but from the confirmation that nothing I had done, not the articles, not the silent success, not even hosting them in my own property, could pierce the story they'd written about me long ago. I would always be the girl who couldn't sit still through a debate, who rearranged the living room without being asked, who made people uncomfortable by asking how they felt instead of what they earned. And now, even as they ate food I had handpicked and complimented views I had preserved, they still believed I wasn't worth a seat at their table. I didn't walk out, I stayed. I moved toward the side of the garden where a few guests were enjoying dessert and lingered near the servers to hear what was being said about the space. One woman whispered that it was the most intentional venue she'd ever been in. Another said she hadn't cried during dinner in years, but something about the candles reminded her of her grandmother. These weren't my family, but they saw something. They felt what I'd spent years building. And in that moment, their quiet awe felt louder than any toast. I turned away before anyone recognized me. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't want revenge. What I wanted was to stand in the middle of what I had built and know that it was real whether or not they ever understood it. Tomorrow they would find out. The next morning arrived cool and overcast, a rare softness for a Los Angeles summer. I woke before dawn, not from nerves but from habit. Years of opening retreats had trained my body to move before the city did. I dressed in black slacks, and a light silk blouse pulled my hair back in a low twist, and made myself tea the way I always did, 1 spoon of honey, nothing else. Outside, the courtyard was already being prepared for brunch. Servers moved through the early silence like water, setting tables, fluffing cushions, checking citrus displays and flower placements. The air smelled of grapefruit and lemongrass. The music system tested a light instrumental loop I had once designed for grounding anxiety. The space didn't feel tense, it felt ready. I spent the morning with Madison reviewing the final layout of the farewell brunch and confirming every special request. Theo wanted soft-boiled eggs exactly 4.5 minutes. Clara had a particular brand of mineral water flown in from Switzerland. Audrey insisted on non-native eucalyptus branches at her table because she read somewhere it suggested elegance. We didn't roll our eyes, we executed. That's what hospitality meant here. Not flattery, not performance, but delivery without ego. After all, this was the final day. They would eat, talk, take family photos, say their goodbyes. And in their minds, the story would be complete. They came, they celebrated, and no one disturbed the image they needed to maintain. I planned to let them keep it until one moment offered itself too perfectly to ignore. By noon, guests were gathering in the atrium for a group portrait. The photographer, one of the best in town, adjusted the natural lighting, arranging the family in tiers of legacy. Grandparents, parents, cousins, future leaders. I stood just outside the glass wall watching the symmetry. My mother fixed her lipstick. Audrey called out table numbers for lunch. My father stood near the center, hand on Theo's shoulder, the legacy visual locked in. I waited, not out of hesitation but because timing is everything. Then Madison stepped beside me holding a slim black folder and said quietly, "Audrey just asked to meet the founder before departure. She thinks it'll be good for press. Do you want me to handle it?" I looked at her, then at the room full of people who had spoken about me, like I didn't exist, who had occupied my sanctuary without once asking who created it. I exhaled slowly and said, "I'll go." I walked into the garden with no announcement, no spotlight. I passed a server who smiled and gave a slight nod, unaware of the weight behind the moment. I made my way toward Audrey, who stood beside the centerpiece table, her champagne glass half full, her eyes scanning for the owner she imagined would be male, middle-aged, maybe with a vague European accent. When I stopped in front of her, she looked up and smiled politely, not recognizing me at first. Then her face froze. "Dixie," she said, not quite a question. "Good afternoon," I replied evenly. "You wanted to meet the founder." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Behind her, Clara turned, catching my name, and slowly stood. My mother stopped mid-sentence. Theo frowned. The photographer lowered his camera. "I hope your stay has been everything you imagined," I continued. "I've been watching closely to make sure every detail met the standard." Audrey set her glass down too quickly, the rim clinking against the table. "You're the owner?" she asked, like the words didn't line up. "I'm the founder, the creative director, and the majority shareholder," I said, not with pride but with clarity. "This property, like the others in the Bloom portfolio, is a space I designed from the ground up." There was no need to say more. The silence spoke louder than anything else could. My mother stood but didn't move toward me. Clara's hand went to her necklace. Theo looked away. I saw their confusion folding into calculation. The gap between the story they told themselves and the reality standing in front of them was too wide to bridge with denial. I wasn't going to say anything, I said, scanning the room now, no longer just looking at Audrey. "I thought about staying quiet, letting you enjoy the space, leave your compliments at the front desk, and walk away with the same version of me you've always chosen to believe. But then I thought about the team behind this space, the values we built it on, and I realized something. Silence may be noble, but it isn't always honest." They still hadn't said a word. Not one apology, not one acknowledgement, not one correction. And that was fine, because this moment wasn't about them catching up. It was about me stepping forward. I'll let you get back to your farewell brunch, I finished. But I thought it was important that you know where you've been this weekend. You weren't just celebrating at Bloom. You were standing in the middle of everything I was told would never work. And I hope, if nothing else, the service made you feel seen. I turned and walked away slowly, not for effect, but because I wanted them to sit in the stillness I had crafted, to feel the shape of their discomfort in a room designed for awareness. No one followed me. The hours that followed were filled with a strange stillness, not silence exactly, but a kind of muting, as if someone had turned the volume down on every conversation just enough for awareness to seep in. I didn't return to the brunch. I stayed in my office on the second floor, overlooking the garden through a panel of tinted glass. From there, I could see them trying to recalibrate. My mother remained seated, both hands resting on the table like she was waiting for instructions. Clara walked in slow circles around the herb garden, her shoes clicking against the stone like the sound might help her think. Audrey had disappeared entirely. Theo stood near the hedge wall with his arms crossed, staring at a server who offered him more coffee and received no response. No one said anything out loud, but their posture said enough. The veneer had cracked, and beneath it they were scrambling to understand how they had ended up inside a world they had spent years dismissing. The realization didn't come with apology or sudden warmth. It came with stunned calculation. Who had they been speaking about all weekend? Who had they excluded in their stories only to find that she had been writing the script behind the scenes the entire time? I expected nothing from them. That made it easier. But I still allowed myself to wonder whether any of them might come find me. Not to grovel, just to ask. The knock came 2 hours later. It was soft, hesitant, and slightly uneven, like someone unsure if they were welcome. I opened the door and found Clara standing there, no longer polished but exposed in a way I had never seen. Her arms were folded tightly, not out of confidence but defense. "I didn't know," she said, not waiting for me to invite her in. None of us did. I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. She sat slowly, eyes taking in the room, like it might explain something she hadn't prepared to face. "You built this?" she asked, though she already knew. "All of it," I nodded. "With help, but yes, it's mine." Clara exhaled and stared down at her knees. "I always thought you were just somewhere doing yoga retreats or something. I didn't know this was real." I didn't correct her. I didn't need to. She already looked like someone who was realizing the cost of every assumption she'd ever made. She looked up again. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" The question sat there for a long time. I thought about all the reasons I could give. Pride, self-preservation, the exhaustion of trying to convince people who only saw what they wanted to see. But in the end, I said the simplest truth. You never asked. She closed her eyes briefly, like the sentence hit somewhere she wasn't ready to be touched. "I'm sorry," she said. "I really am. We all treated you like you were playing house while the rest of us were building empires. And all this time you were creating something with more soul than any of us could understand." I didn't rush to comfort her. That wasn't what she needed, and it wasn't what I was there to give. But I nodded slowly, letting her words settle between us, not as closure but as something honest for the first time in years. "Does it feel good?" she asked suddenly, her voice lower now. Being the one who made it, I looked around the office out toward the garden, where the servers were clearing dishes and folding linens, where guests who weren't family continued to linger just a bit longer, like they weren't quite ready to return to their lives. "It feels right," I said. "Not because of who sees it now, but because of who it helps." She stood then, not with urgency, but with a kind of reverence, like she didn't quite know how to leave a space she hadn't expected to find sacred. "You're different," she said before opening the door, "but you always were." And then she was gone. Later that evening, I received a message from Madison saying Audrey had checked out early. No explanation, no thank you. Just a driver waiting by the gate, and 2 large trunks packed like she couldn't get far enough away from the moment. I didn't respond. Some stories close themselves without a final sentence. That night, I walked through the lobby alone. I passed the seating area where my father had once sat without looking up at the staff. I touched the edge of the desk where my mother had set down her bag without saying thank you. I paused at the scent library where Clara had once lingered, inhaling rosemary like it triggered something she didn't know she missed. Every inch of this space carried the energy of someone I used to be. And now, it also held the imprint of who I had become. I didn't need to be welcomed back. I had never really left. They just hadn't noticed I was here all along. The next morning came slowly, not with fanfare or tension, but with the kind of quiet that usually settles over a space once something unspoken has finally surfaced. The rest of the guests had already begun checking out. The garden was quieter than usual, the dining staff more reserved. I moved through the space without urgency, stopping to thank the team, reviewing the last batch of guest notes, and confirming that Audrey's departure had been uneventful. When I returned to my office, there was a message waiting for me on my desk. Not an email, not a text, but an actual note handwritten in slanted, familiar strokes. "Can we speak before we leave? Dad." I stared at the paper for a full minute before picking it up. There were no other words, no hint of tone. Just that short sentence and a name I had once said without pause, now so distant I wasn't sure how to hear it in my own voice. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. 20 minutes later, I walked down to the terrace and found him sitting alone, back straight, hands folded, eyes on the horizon, like he was rehearsing something he'd never had to practice before. He didn't look up when I approached, just gestured toward the seat across from him, a gesture so automatic, I almost smiled, but I didn't. We sat in silence for a few seconds that stretched long enough to become memory. Then he spoke. "Your mother's in the car," he said, not as an excuse, but maybe as a buffer. "She didn't know how to start this." I nodded once. He looked at me then properly, for the first time in years. Not like a daughter to be guided or a disappointment to be managed, but as something he hadn't allowed himself to define. "It's a beautiful place," he said. "I've never been somewhere that felt this. Intentional." The compliment hung in the air unfinished. He wasn't someone used to giving them without conditions. I waited, letting him find his pace. I saw the wall of quotes he continued, the one near the meditation path. That line from Rumi, "Try not to resist the changes that come your way. Instead, let life live through you." He paused again, like he was unsure if he'd quoted it correctly. That one stopped me. I folded my hands in my lap. It stopped me too. That's why it's there. He nodded, then looked down at his own hands. For a man whose entire life had been built on controlling outcomes, this moment was clearly disorienting. "We always thought we were protecting you," he said. "When you turned down Wharton, when you moved out with no plan, we assumed you'd come back eventually. That it was just a phase. Something soft and idealistic. Like you needed to get it out of your system before you did something serious." He didn't say it like a justification, he said it like a confession. "We measured everything by strategy, outcomes, networks, and what you were doing didn't fit any of that. So instead of trying to understand it, we dismissed it. I dismissed it." The words weren't dramatic, they weren't emotional, but they were heavy, like stone that had taken too long to lay down. I didn't rush to forgive him. I didn't say it was okay. I just let him feel the weight of what had been unacknowledged for too long. "I built Bloom," I said slowly, "because I wanted people to have a space where they didn't have to earn their worth, just to be allowed to breathe. I didn't need the world to call it success, I just needed it to feel honest." He looked up again, and for the first time I saw something fragile in his expression. Not regret exactly. Not pride either. Something closer to realization. "You did more than we ever imagined," he said. "Not in spite of us. Maybe because of us. But I don't expect that to excuse what we did." It was the closest thing to an apology he could manage, and for the first time, I didn't feel small in front of him. I didn't feel like the daughter who hadn't measured up. I felt like someone who had finally become whole enough to see him for what he was, a man raised by men who never taught him how to see softness as strength. We sat like that for a while longer, not as father and daughter trying to fix the past, but as two people finally sitting in the same truth. When we stood, he didn't reach for a hug. He just nodded once, almost like he was asking permission to step back into the world, having seen it differently. I gave him a small smile. "Safe drive," I said. "Tell Mom she can stop pretending she left her sunglasses behind." He exhaled something between a laugh and a sigh and walked away. And just like that, something small shifted. Not everything, but enough. The days that followed were quiet in the best way. Most of the team had returned to regular rhythm, prepping for the next wellness retreat and clearing out the remnants of the D'Amelio booking. The linens were sent out, the custom menus archived, the scent blends for the guest suites restored to their original profiles. On paper, it was like any other high-end event, but there was something different in the air. Not in the property itself, but in me. I no longer felt like I was managing my family's proximity, always adjusting to keep some illusion intact. For the first time, I felt like I had let the truth stand at its full height, not to impress anyone, but because hiding had finally cost me more than it protected. Clara sent me a voice note later that week. It wasn't long, just her saying that she hadn't stopped thinking about what I'd built. She didn't ask for a follow-up, didn't frame it with suggestions for scaling or merging. She just said she was proud in a way that surprised even her. That was enough. I didn't need more. Theo, on the other hand, stayed silent. No email, no text, no post-event remarks. But I saw that he had followed the Bloom Retreats account quietly, and 2 days later he reshared one of our articles about emotional fatigue and male identity without comment. I didn't reach out. Some people need longer to catch up, others never will. My mother didn't write, but a package arrived at the property addressed to me in her script. Inside was a framed photo I hadn't seen in years. It was me at 15, standing beside a makeshift canopy I had built in our backyard, hosting one of those elaborate welcome rituals I used to invent for visiting cousins. Everyone in the photo looked mildly confused except me. I was beaming. On the back of the frame was a note. "You've always known how to make people feel like they belong. I just didn't know how to value that before. Mom." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she had ever come to reaching across the gap with something more than correction. I placed the photo on the shelf beside my first prototype scent bottle and the dried flower from our opening night in Lake Travis. I stood there for a long time, remembering that girl who used to rearrange spaces in silence, waiting for someone to notice the difference in the air. And now, finally, people did. Not because I forced them, but because I had stopped needing them to. What changed after that wasn't the business. Bloom kept growing, but slowly, the way things grow when they're designed to last. I became more visible not by chasing attention, but by accepting that sometimes sharing the story is part of the service. I started speaking at panels about emotional design and guest empathy, always tying it back to lived experience. Not once did I name-drop my family. Not once did I use them as a cautionary tale. I wasn't building against them anymore. I was building because of me. My personal life, which had once been so tightly walled off from my work, began to open up again. I said yes to dinners. I reconnected with old classmates who remembered me before the split. I dated without pretending to be someone more conventional or more palatable. And when asked what I did, I no longer minimized it. I said it plainly. I create spaces where people feel safe enough to remember who they really are. Some guests returned to Bloom again and again, not because they couldn't afford other places, but because something here made them feel less alone. They'd say things like, "I don't know what it is, but this place understands me." And every time I thought, this is what success feels like. Not loud, not flashy, just right. There were still moments when the old ache flickered at a wedding where everyone asked about siblings, at a fundraiser where my last name made someone pause before asking if I was one of those D'Amelios. But the sting didn't last. Because now I had a context larger than their assumptions. Months later, I hosted a private evening event at Bloom for women in design and emotional architecture. At the last minute, Clara showed up. She didn't make a scene, didn't bring a +1, didn't ask for press. She sat in the back, took notes, and at the end waited until everyone had cleared out. Then she hugged me. A real one. The kind that doesn't come with comparison or agenda. Just bone-deep warmth. "You were never behind," she whispered. "We were just looking in the wrong direction." And that was the moment I knew the story had changed. Not just mine, but ours. There was no final ceremony, no dramatic family group photo, no retrospective speech handed out at brunch. The end came quietly, in the way most real endings do. One day I walked through the main corridor of Bloom, past the wall of gratitude notes we had collected over the years, and realized I no longer flinched when I saw my last name written in a stranger's hand. It wasn't mine to carry or correct anymore. I had built something bigger than the name, bigger than the rejection, and certainly bigger than any one weekend could summarize. It wasn't about proving them wrong. Somewhere along the way, it had become about proving myself right. The reunion was never rescheduled, at least not in any formal way, but I stayed in occasional contact with Clara, who sent thoughtful updates and sometimes forwarded opportunities she thought might interest me. My father sent one more note a few months later, a brief line about having toured a sensory healing clinic in Lisbon and thinking of me. I didn't reply, but I smiled when I read it. That was enough. My mother never reached out again. I think her way of coping was to hold on to the old version of me, the quiet one, the too sensitive one, the dreamer who didn't have what it took. Letting that version go would require her to change her own story, and not everyone has the tools or courage to do that. I had learned to love people even when they couldn't meet me where I stood. It didn't mean I had to shrink. It just meant I stopped begging for understanding in rooms that had already made up their minds. That lesson took years to settle, but once it did, it changed how I moved through the world. I no longer felt the need to correct people's assumptions. I let them think what they needed to think. Because the people who mattered didn't need convincing. They saw me before the headline, before the business, before the retreat center, with my name in brushed brass at the entrance. One afternoon, during a guided closing session for a visiting leadership group, someone raised their hand and asked, "What would you say to the version of yourself who was once told she didn't belong?" I paused before answering, not because I didn't know, but because the moment felt like more than a quote. It felt like something I wanted to get right. "I'd tell her she did belong," I said, "not because she earned it, but because she never needed permission in the first place." The room was quiet after that, not the kind of silence that's awkward, but the kind that means something had just clicked. That's what Bloom had become for me, a place where things clicked quietly, but deeply. A place where people came in fragmented and left a little more whole, not because they had been fixed, but because they had finally been seen. Sometimes late at night, I'd walk the property alone and stop in front of the original building, the one where my name now stood engraved across the archway. I never lit it up on purpose. It didn't need to glow to prove its worth, but occasionally a guest would post a photo and it would resurface. "Look who owns this place now," the captions would read. And strangers would reply with disbelief, with curiosity, with questions like, "How did she do it?" I never answered publicly. I didn't need to. Because the people who asked that question weren't really looking for strategy. They were looking for hope. And hope, I had learned, doesn't always come with a clean resolution or a viral moment of redemption. Sometimes it just looks like a woman walking calmly through a building that used to be closed to her head, high past the name they once laughed at, toward the life she built with both hands. So now when people ask if I've forgiven my family, I tell them it's not really about that. Forgiveness is too small a word for what happens when you stop needing closure from people who never offered it in the first place. What I found instead was clarity, and with it came peace. And if someone asks what revenge looks like to me now, I say this: it looks like showing up fully in a world that once underestimated you and leaving the doors open behind you just wide enough for someone else to walk through. What would you do if the people who once called you a failure had to watch you succeed from the front row?